trade and commerce. Notice that the early Americans understood if you increase the money supply, you steal from the American people. Our founding fathers did not steal from their fellow Americans. They understood the nature of inflation. In 1763, the Bank of England introduced a bill that no colony could issue colonial scrip. The colonies had to issue bonds and to sell those bonds back to the Bank of England. The money of the colonies was to be based on debt. We were going to borrow our money from the Bank of England. The result, in less than 1 year, there was unemployment because the Bank of England gave only 1/2 as many units as in scrip that they gave out in the new money. The money supply, in other words, had a 50% drop. Franklin said, number 60, the colonies would gladly have borne the little tax on tea had it not been that England took away from the colonies their money. The refusal of King George to allow the colonies to operate an honest money system which freed the ordinary man from the clutches of the, and notice his word, the money manipulators. So Franklin called these people money manipulators, was probably the prime cause of the revolution. So now we've been told in our history books that the prime issue, the major issue of the American Revolution was, quote, taxation without representation, unquote. After we read Ben Franklin, was that the major issue? No. Ben Franklin said the major issue was created money, borrowed money, debt, and interest. Our founding fathers understood the nature of the game, and they were opposed to it. Central banking has been and continues to be one of the goals of this conspiracy. Let me remind you of an earlier discussion that our founding fathers had about this matter. When our founding fathers wrote the Constitution, they carefully wrote this, Article 1, Section 8, into our Constitution, and I've quoted it in number 61. Article 1, Section 8 of our Constitution reads today, 1988, the Congress shall have power to, and notice the word, coin money. The majority of the money that we carry today has not been coined. It's been printed. It's been borrowed, as we're going to see. Now this is a $100 bill. It's an enlarged bill I found someplace, and I thought I'd save it, but I want to show you something. I want you to notice the top line of your money. It reads, quote, Federal Reserve Note, unquote. This money that we're carrying today has been borrowed from the Federal Reserve. That's what it says on the top line of the money. Now I want you to notice what it says in the left-hand corner. When we zero in on that, we read that our money says, quote, this note, notice that word, note, is legal tender for all debts, public and private. This note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. As we've covered in the past of this series, our money used to say, quote, this certifies that there is on deposit in the Treasury $100 or whatever amount shown on the currency in gold, payable to the bearer on demand. In other words, our money used to be backed by gold. And that phrase was up in that upper left-hand corner. But it's not there anymore, is it? Because our money is now backed but by anything, or backed by nothing but debt. Our money is no longer backed by gold and silver, it's backed by debt, borrowed money. The Federal Reserve issues this phony money even though gold and silver coin is demanded by our Constitution. Our founding fathers wrote number 62, Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution. Even today, our Constitution reads, quote, no state shall make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debt, unquote. Now, I want you to notice that we have no constitutional way to pay our taxes, to pay any debt in our states, the 50 states today, because the Constitution demands gold and our money is not backed by gold. There is no constitutional way to pay debt in the state of Arizona or any of the 50 states. There were two major leaders of the American Revolution. The first was George Washington, who was the first commander of the American Army and, of course, our first president. And the second major leader was Ben Franklin. Mr. Franklin went to France as a representative of the American government. We talked about that during our study of the French Revolution. Now, why is it important that we point these two gentlemen out? Now, we've been told by our history books that the reason these two individuals stepped forward was because they were extremely popular. And we were told that because of their popularity, Washington could raise an army, and Franklin could go to Europe and get foreign assistance. But I'd like to share with you that there is another reason, and I believe the main reason, that Washington and Franklin became the two major leaders of our American Revolution. Both George Washington and Ben Franklin were members of the Masonic Lodge, and they could rally other Masons to the revolution. In January of 1774, two important events took place. Number one, Ben Franklin, member of the Masons, made a deal with the French Foreign Minister Vergennes for the purchase of weapons. Vergennes also was a member of the Masonic Lodge. And secondly, France loaned money to America to fight the revolution. Washington was made commander-in-chief of all the American troops. All of Washington's staff officers that he appointed were members of the Masonic Lodge. And every general officer that Washington appointed was a member of the Masons. Washington appointed 12 generals to the top office, 12 general officers, and if you count Washington, that makes 13. Now this is a picture of George Washington dressed as a Mason. George Washington quite often appeared dressed this way in public. And I want you to notice his white apron. This is a symbol of his membership in the Masonic Lodge. Remember that white apron. We're going to see it again on other Masons as we continue our study of American history. Now this is another drawing of Washington dressed as a Mason. We've already shown this picture once before, I believe. And here Washington is laying the cornerstone of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., dressed as a Mason. Now England sent fellow Masons to America to fight the American Revolution. One of England's commanding generals was William Howe. He was the head of the English Army, William Howe. The top-ranking admiral was his brother, Richard Howe. And another top general in the English Army was Charles Cornwallis. All three of these generals and admirals were members of the Masonic Lodge. I'll tell you why that's important in a few minutes. The Masons take oaths that obligate them to protect their fellow Masons. In the third degree, every Mason says, number 63, I promise and swear that should I ever see the grand hailing sign or the word accompanying it, and the person who gave it appearing to be in distress, I will fly to his relief at the risk of my life. In the Masonic Handbook, the Mason is told, number 64, your obligations enjoin you not to strike a brother master Mason. Masons do not kill their fellow Masons. This fact is well known among the Masonic order. In other words, Masons will not kill their opposition, even though they're enemies. But if one Mason gives the grand hailing sign, any Mason worldwide is obligated to respect it by the oath that they take. Now, why didn't the Howe brothers tell the government, the English government, we can't fight America because their officers are all fellow Masons? They knew that, I believe, that Washington and all of his generals were Masons. I believe that they did tell the English government, because I believe that England did not want to win the American Revolution. I believe that the purpose of the English government, by appointing these Masons to fight fellow Masons, was to delay the war, not win it. They were to make the war as costly as possible. Then The English bankers, who were the ones who started the revolution, would create a central bank, loan money to the government to pay for the costs of the deadly and costly war, and then the bankers would collect interest on money created out of nothing. Our founding fathers debated this question about the banks and the banking institutions. Alexander Hamilton was in favor of the central bank, owned by private bankers. Thomas Jefferson was opposed to the banking institution, the banking establishment. And we're going to see that both of these men wrestled with this issue during the early days of the American Revolution. Jefferson wrote, number 1, if the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of their property until their children will wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. Prior to the American Revolution, the Continental Congress issued paper money that was unbacked by gold or silver. They increased the money supply more than necessary, and that's why our money was not worth a continental. That caused inflation. But the important thing is that the money was not borrowed. There was no debt, therefore no interest payments. Alexander Hamilton offered the United States the Bank of the United States, which was to become a profit-making institution. It was to be privately owned. It would have the power to loan money to Congress, to the government, at interest. And they would have the power to create that money out of nothing. In 1788, President Washington made what I consider to be his most serious mistake during his 8 years in office. He appointed Hamilton as the Secretary of the Treasury. And Hamilton created the first Bank of the United States. The original capital of the Bank of the United States was $12 million, of which the Bank of England owned $10 million. I want you to notice that the first Bank of the United States was to be privately owned. It was not owned by the government. It was created by the government. Let's continue now with our study of that first bank. The bank was to start in 1791. It was to have a 20-year charter and was to lapse in 1811. 1791 plus 20 is obviously 1811. Jefferson spoke out against this bank. He said there is no constitutional authority to create the bank. Here's what he said, number 2. Jefferson, the incorporation of a bank and the powers assumed by it have not been delegated to the United States by the Constitution. Jefferson was right. When Jefferson became president, and also James Madison, the two presidents paid off the national debt of the American Revolution. But two others during that time, two other Americans were opposed. These two were John C. Calhoun and Henry Clay. These two individuals urged the government to do two things. 1, declare a war against England, and 2, create a national bank. The two go together, as we're going to see. In 1811, President James Madison let the charter of the first Bank of the United States lapse. Obviously, he was president. The charter was to run for 20 years, from 1791 to 1811. Madison says no renewal of the bank charter. There was to be no central bank owned by individuals. But Clay and Calhoun were successful, even in spite of all that, and we experienced the War of 1812 between the United States and England. Now, isn't it interesting that the War of 1812 occurred the year after the bank lapsed in 1811? I think the two are connected, and I'll show you why in a minute. Number 3, the War of 1812 was a war of anomalies. The United States went to war in part over Great Britain's orders in council, which were repealed 2 days before war was declared. The main issues of the war were completely ignored in the treaty that brought the war to an end, and the greatest battle of the war was fought when the war was over. But it didn't matter. The bankers wanted a war, and they got a war. Any war would do. The bankers had to have a war to convince the American people that they needed a national bank, a central bank. Now, the Accidental School of History says that it was a coincidence that the War of 1812 occurred the year after the bank elapsed. I don't think it was. But we've been told over and over again there's no connection. And I believe one preceded the other. I believe the purpose of the War of 1812 was to create a privately owned national bank that would have the power to create paper money out of nothing, loan it to the government at interest, creating debt that we'd pay back. The War of 1812 ended in 1814, and by 1815 the government was on the verge of bankruptcy because it had no way to pay for the cost of the war. So in 1816, Congress chartered the second bank of the United States. They borrowed $80 million to pay for the costs of the war. And once again, the bank was to have a 20-year charter from 1816 to 1836. In 1816, Jefferson spoke out against the second bank of the United States. Here's what he said, number 4. I believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. The issuing power should be taken from the banks and restored to the government, to whom it properly belongs. The scarcity of money, number 5, during the War of 1812 and the inflationary policies of the Second United States Bank in the first few years after 1816 caused banks to spread. In other words, they were, first of all, had a scarce money supply, and then they increased it rapidly, and that caused banks to spread. But then came the Depression of 1819, and the big bank reversed its policy and began a contraction of the money supply. Money flowed out of the West, leaving in its wake a trail of bankruptcies and a large debtor population unable to meet obligations. In other words, the Bank of the United States knew the plan. They knew that increasing the money supply would cause inflation. They knew that decreasing the money supply would cause deflation. That was the purpose of the Bank of the 1816 and the Bank of 1791. The purpose of both banks was to transfer money and assets to the bankers. Now, the next step in our study occurred on August the 14th, 1826, when Captain William Morgan, a member of the Masons, published a book revealing the secrets of the Masonic Order. His book was called Illustrations of Masonry by one of the fraternity who has devoted 30 years to the subject. William Morgan wrote why he was exposing the Masonic Order. Morgan wrote number 6, the bane, meaning the ruin of our civil institutions. Please remember that. The ruin of our civil institutions is to be found in Masonry, already powerful and daily becoming more so. I owe my country exposure of its dangers. Notice that Morgan was warning us that the Masons wanted to destroy our civil institutions. Our civil institutions, our old civil institutions, are called the Old World Order. Morgan had discovered the true purpose of the Masons in the United States, to destroy the old world order and to create a new world order. 1 month later, on September the 11th, 1826, Captain Morgan was murdered by the Masons here in America. The murderers of Captain Morgan were never brought to justice, but Captain Morgan was obviously too close to the truth, and he was murdered. Now, I don't know for certain that Captain William Morgan took this particular oath, but if he did, he could have expected to sacrifice his life because he revealed their secrets. In his book, Morgan reveals that the initiate into the Masons takes an oath that he will be murdered if he reveals their secrets. Morgan quotes this oath that new Masons take when they join the order. The initiate says, number 7, I bind myself under no less penalty than to have my throat cut across, my tongue torn out by the roots, and my body buried in the rough sands of the sea at low water mark. Next step in our America's history occurred in 1828 with the election of 1828. Andrew Jackson was elected the President of the United States. Andrew Jackson was opposed to the central bank issue, the central bank concept. Jackson wrote, number 8, I am one of those who do not believe that a national debt is a national blessing, but rather a curse to a republic, inasmuch as it is calculated to raise around the administration a moneyed aristocracy. Notice the word, a phrase rather, a moneyed aristocracy, dangerous to the liberties of the country. Jackson understood. Prior to the election of 1832, this nation's first third party was forming. The party called themselves the Anti-Masons. Number 9. On September the 11th, 1830, delegates from 11 states met at Philadelphia to denounce the Freemasonic order and to call upon their countrymen to join in a political crusade to save the nation from, quote, subversion and tyranny, unquote, at the hands of the Masons. Notice, the Anti-Masons wanted to save the nation from, quote, subversion and tyranny, unquote. The Anti-Masons must have known something that the rest of America didn't know. In January of 1832, Nelson Biddle, who was head of the Second Bank of the United States, decided to ask Congress for renewal of the bank's charter in 1832, 4 years before its current charter expired. Biddle reasoned that since Jackson was seeking re-election, he might see to it to his advantage not to allow the matter of the central bank to become an issue and thus permit the bank to have its re-charter. But Jackson did not do that. On July the 10th, 1832, Jackson vetoed the Bank of the United States bill that was to recreate the Bank of the United States to become the third bank. Jackson vetoed the legislation. He wanted to let the American people decide. And the third bank, the renewal of the second bank, became a campaign issue. Andrew Jackson campaigned strictly and almost solely for re-election in 1832 on the slogan, quote, bank and no Jackson, or no bank and Jackson. In other words, if you want the bank, you vote against me. If you don't want the bank, you vote for me. I will repeal it, make sure it doesn't get created. And sure enough, the voters responded, number 10. In the election of 1832, Andrew Jackson got 55% of the vote. Henry Clay, the man who wanted the renewal of the charter, who wanted the War of 1816, got 37% of the vote. And the Anti-Masons, the third party, this nation's first third party, got 8% of the nation's vote and actually carried the state of Vermont. I don't know why Vermont. If some of you people see that in Vermont, perhaps you know, you might want to write to me and let me know, because someone in your state understood. After the veto of the bank by Andrew Jackson, Biddle responded by contracting loans, tightening credit all along the line. Businesses failed, men were thrown out of work, and money was unobtainable. In other words, Biddle contracted the money supply, causing a deflation. I want you to remember from several weeks before that we defined the word inflation as an increase in the money supply and a deflation as a decrease. You can cause business cycles by increasing and then decreasing the money supply. Andrew Jackson wrote, number 11, on December the 2nd, 1834, the bold effort the present bank has made to control the government, the distress it has wantonly produced, are but premonitions of the fate that awaits the American people should they be deluded into a perpetuation of this institution or the establishment of another like it. Jackson said no central bank. On July the 3rd, 1832, Andrew Jackson told his vice president, Martin Van Buren, number 12, "The bank, Mr. Van Buren, is trying to kill me, but I will kill it." Notice, the bank was trying to kill Andrew Jackson. On January the 30th, 1835, as President Jackson was leaving the House of Representatives, a man by the name of Richard Lawrence stepped out into Jackson's path and fired 2 pistols at Jackson, not more than 6 feet away. Only the caps exploded as the charges inside the gun failed to go off. Now, this was the first time that anyone had made an attempt on the life of an American president. Apparently, someone wanted Jackson dead because he dared challenge the banking system. After he was arrested, the man who shot at President Jackson claimed, number 13, that he had been in touch with the powers in Europe which had promised to intervene if any attempt was made to punish him. Now, I ask you, what European powers were powerful enough to intervene in the prosecution of Richard Lawrence? I don't know, but it seems logical to me that the European bankers had much to gain by Jackson's death. I just don't know. It's just, once again, another interesting coincidence. After the election of 1832, Jackson paid off the national debt, but the bankers still continued to run America. I want to bring you up to a little more current to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt was the president during the 1930s all the way through World War II, 1944, 45 or so, and Roosevelt wrote this, a letter in which he said, number 14, Franklin Roosevelt admitted that the bankers still run America. Roosevelt wrote, number 14, "The real truth of the matter is, as you and I know, that a financial element has owned the government since the days of Andrew Jackson." Mr. Roosevelt admitted that the bankers still run America. Over 100 years after Andrew Jackson, Franklin Roosevelt said the bankers have still been successful. They run America. So between 1836, when the charter lapsed, and 1860, America had no central bank. The bankers had failed 3 times to give us a central bank. In 1776, with the American Revolution. In 1812, with the War of 1812, and they failed to defeat Jackson in the election of 1832. The next step in our study is to learn about the Rothschild family of Europe. I don't believe we'll have enough time to do that tonight. We'll start that again next week. We'll get into a little more study of the Rothschild family to see what their involvement was in the Civil War and the period between 1836 and the Civil War. And we'll also continue our study of banking, bank deposits, etc., to show you how, after the Civil War, the bankers changed their strategy. And they intentionally caused depressions in 1873, 1893, and 1907. We'll continue our study of bankers next week. I invite you to tune in to us again next week as we continue to explore the secrets of history. Thank you so very, very much.
Welcome to Secrets of History, a series of lectures exploring the conspiratorial view of history. It is the contention of historian Ralph Epperson that wars, revolutions, and depressions are planned years in advance, and that those who have been involved in the planning of these events have been ensuring that their involvement has been removed from recorded history. It will be Ralph Epperson's purpose to discuss the major events of the past and to remove the veil that has been utilized to cover up the secrets of history.
My name is Ralph Epperson, and I'm the host for this series. Secrets of History is a 24-week lecture series exploring the conspiratorial view of history. I've been studying the view of history that holds that the major events of the past have been planned years in advance, and I've been studying that for 24 years. About 2 years ago, I published my book entitled The Unseen Hand, An Introduction to the Conspiratorial View of History. That book came out in 1985. Tonight we're going to continue our study of the early years of America's history around the time of the Civil War. And to start our study tonight, we've got to introduce you, the viewer, to the Rothschild family of Europe. Without understanding them, we can't understand, I believe, the early part of America's history. Let's start our study tonight with the family, and we'll show you the grandfather first, and then the children, and then the 5 sons at the end. Let's start with number 15. The grandfather of the Rothschild family was named Amschel Moses Bauer. Now you'll notice his last name is Bauer, and his son changed the last name from Bauer to Rothschild. The son's name was Meyer Amschel Rothschild. Meyer Amschel Rothschild had 5 sons. The first son was called Amschel Rothschild. He was the eldest. The second son was Solomon Rothschild. He was the second in line. The third son was Nathan Rothschild. He was third. The fourth son was Karl Rothschild, fourth in line. And the last was James Rothschild, the 5th son. Meyer Amschel Rothschild sent his 5 sons to the various European cities to establish branch banks of the Rothschild banking establishment. Each one of these 5 was to be powerful enough to loan to the various host governments. Nathan was sent to London, England. James was sent to Paris, France. Solomon was sent to Vienna, Austria. Karl went to Naples, Italy. And Amschel Meyer went to Frankfurt, Germany. So we can see that each of the 5 sons went to the major European capitals in that day. To show you that they understood the process, Baron Meyer Amschel Rothschild said this, number 16, "Permit me to control the money of a nation, and I care not who makes its laws." Now that we've introduced you briefly to the Rothschild family, we're going to try to examine what influence they had in the Civil War, because that's our next study, is the Civil War of 1861 to 1865. General William Tecumseh Sherman, a prominent Northern general, wrote this in his book, Memoirs 1, number 17. "The truth is not always palatable and should not always be told." What was the truth that he wanted not to tell us, or they wanted not to tell us? We're going to try to examine that. In the biography of a well-known senator during the Civil War, Senator Zachariah Chandler of Michigan, we read this quote, number 18. "The secret history of these days, meaning the Civil War, concealing many startling revelations, has yet been sparingly written. It is doubtful if the veil will ever be more than slightly lifted." What was the senator talking about? What startling revelations have been kept from the American people? I believe I've discovered many of them, and I'd like to discuss them for you now. As I said, from 1836 to 1861, the United States had no central bank. All currency was issued by state banks, and all currency was backed by gold. The European bankers had to act again. The Rothschild brothers sent 2 of their agents to the United States. One went to the north and one went to the south. The Rothschild representative in the north was August Belmont. August Belmont, in 1829, went to work for the Frankfurt, Germany branch of the Rothschilds and came to the United States in 1837. The Belmont Stakes horse race, by the way, is named after this gentleman, August Belmont, an extremely wealthy and influential banker during his day. The Rothschild representative in the South was Judah P. Benjamin, who later became a senator, or was a senator from Louisiana, and later the Attorney General and the Secretary of War in the Confederacy. Now I want you to remember, we've discussed this before, and we'll discuss it for tonight and for several nights following, because we're going to be covering several wars. But I want you to remember that wars cost money. Governments have to pay for those wars, and one of the easiest ways to do it, as we've discussed in the past, is to borrow. If you can't borrow from the taxpayers or from the people, the government has to create a central bank. The central bank has the power to loan that money back to the government at interest, and that's what this thing is all about. So the purpose of the Civil War was to force the United States into a war to create a central bank. The problem in the Civil War, or prior to the Civil War, was who were they going to get to attack the United States? Who were they going to have a war with the United States involved? They looked at England and France, and during the American Revolution and the War of 1812, they discovered that it was very difficult to supply your army over a 3,000-mile ocean. This was a major problem that they recognized. They asked themselves whether they could get someone on the American continent to attack the United States, and they looked at Canada, where they had some control, but Canada was too small. Mexico was also too small, and also they had no control or very little control of those two nations. So they didn't, because neither Canada nor Mexico, as far as I was able to determine, had a central bank under the control of these bankers. So the plan became then the attempt to create an enemy for the United States. So they had to divide the United States into a north and a south. That was an arbitrary decision made, I believe, by the European bankers prior to the war. By the way, in the Masonic symbolism, we've talked a great deal about the Masons, the north is, quote, a place of darkness, unquote, and the south is, quote, the place of the sun, unquote. We've examined the sun and its relationship to Lucifer in the past in this series, and I believe that's interesting, at least if nothing else, an interesting coincidence. If the Masons had anything at all to do with this war, that's why they called it a north and a south. I don't know. Now, what issue were they going to use to divide the United States into a north and a south? Certainly, you would not want to tell the American people that the major issue of the war was a central bank, or the need to create a central bank, because the American people had expressed their opinions frequently, as we've covered in the past, that they did not want a central bank. So the bankers decided to use a legitimate issue, slavery, to incite the people to a cause. In other words, the way to get the people out into the streets or are concerned enough to fight a war is to use an issue that they had some regard for, but not to tell them that the real issue was the central bank. In 1854, a secret society known as the Knights of the Golden Circle was formed, and they were formed to spread secession in the southern states. It's interesting when you study the Knights of the Golden Circle, as I've tried to do for the last, say, maybe 10 years since I've discovered the Knights, was to see who some of its important members were. And this is interesting. I want to bring three of them to your attention. These three were of the many members, but I think these three have some merit in our discussion of the Civil War. The first I want to bring to your attention was Jefferson Davis, the head of the Confederate States and a member of the Knights of the Golden Circle. The second individual I want to bring to your attention is John Wilkes Booth, the assassin, later to be the assassin, of President Abraham Lincoln, and of course a member of the Knights of the Golden Circle. And the third individual I want to bring to your attention is Jesse James, the famous outlaw, was a member of the Knights of the Golden Circle. And by the way, Jesse James, the famous outlaw, was also a 33rd degree Mason. Isn't that interesting? The Knights of the Golden Circle had an oath that each member or initiate was required to take. I want to read part of it because I want to show you how this is going to play a role in the American history in a few minutes. Number 19. The initiate into the Knights took this oath in part. I will solemnly keep all secrets of the Golden Circle, and also that I will faithfully perform whatever I may be commanded. So please remember that. They are going to keep the name of this Golden Circle secret. And secondly, they will do as they're told. And we're going to see an instance where a member was told to keep a secret, and he failed to do so, and he did then what he was told. We'll see how that affected our history in a few minutes. The next step in our study of the Civil War occurred in 1860 with the election of 1860, the presidential election. The two major Republican candidates were, first, Salmon P. Chase, and I believe that Salmon P. Chase was the banker's choice for the presidency of the United States. And he ran against, in the Republican primaries, the man who was ultimately going to win the Republican nomination, Abraham Lincoln, the rail splitter from Illinois. Now, it's interesting that Lincoln was not the choice, but he did win the convention. At that convention, no one won the votes of the majority of the delegates present. Chase finished fourth on the first ballot. On the fourth ballot, Chase threw his support to Lincoln, and Lincoln won the Republican nomination. After the election was over, Lincoln made Chase the Secretary of the Treasury. I believe that Lincoln made the appointment to keep the peace with the Northern bankers who were supporting Salmon P. Chase. I believe Lincoln realized he needed their support. As I said, Lincoln was elected in 1860, and he was inaugurated in March of 1861. In that month, the secession of the southern states started, and ultimately 11 southern states would secede from the Union. When they seceded, they did not form a United States, they formed a confederacy. Now this is interesting. Notice that I said there were 11 states seceding. This is the flag of the South, the Confederate flag, and if you count the number of stars in the flag, you'll notice there are 13, yet only 11 states seceded. Now I don't know why they chose that flag, but it's an interesting coincidence once again that 13 is the Masonic number that is a secret Masonic number. And I find it very interesting that they had 13 stars on their flag with only 11 states seceding. I believe the Masons played an important role in the creation of the South. Now, I don't have any direct evidence that the Masons had any connection with the secession, but once again, it's just an interesting coincidence. When the states formed the Confederacy, they retained their independent nature. The Southern Constitution read, in part, number 20, "We, the people of the Confederate States, each acting for itself and in its sovereign and independent character." Notice, in its independent and sovereign character. We're going to find out why that's important in a few minutes, because remember that they retained their independent and sovereign nature, even though they formed a confederacy. It was not as binding as the United States was when it was created. As I said, Lincoln was inaugurated in March of 1861, and the South fired the first shot of the war at Fort Sumter in April of 1861. Now there's a great deal of dispute as to who fired the first shot. I've read at least 2 or 3 different opinions, but I want to point out to you one that is very, very interesting. Someone said that it was Captain George James who fired the first shot at Fort Sumter. The reason that's interesting is because the captain, by the name of George James, was the father of Jesse James. And Jesse was a member of the Knights of the Golden Circle. Now, I don't know whether or not the captain was a member, but once again, if that's true, it's just another interesting coincidence. Lincoln spoke, when the war started, openly to the American people about, quote, "powerful combinations in the South," unquote. Lincoln saw something other than the war or the slavery as the problem. It was powerful combinations in the South. Lincoln realized that the way to win the war, as any good general or commander-in-chief would realize, the secret to winning a war is to cut off the enemy's supplies. So in April, Lincoln ordered a blockade of the South. Now, why is that interesting? Because many people made money running the blockade. Let me tell you how that happened. Certain Americans would buy European goods, rent ships or buy ships, whatever, and have those ships bring those supplies to the South through the blockade, probably expecting only maybe 1 and 2 or 3 ships to get through the blockade. But when the ship did get through, they would charge exorbitant prices to make exorbitant profits. One of the blockade runners who was extremely successful at this was the father of Colonel Edward Mandell House. His father was named Thomas W. House, and Thomas House was reportedly a Rothschild agent. In other words, the Rothschilds, if this is correct, were making money running the blockade through the South. Mr. House amassed a fortune during the Civil War by blockade running with his own fleet of ships. Isn't that interesting? Remember the name, Colonel Edward Mandell House. We'll see him again in a few minutes. Another blockade runner was Junius Morgan, the father of the American banker J.P. Morgan. Now we're going to see the Morgan family again, especially J.P. Morgan, a little later in tonight's series. The Morgans also made a fortune during the Civil War. Lincoln had to pay for the war now that he saw himself getting involved with, and perhaps as those of you who have studied the Constitution know, the original Constitution had very little taxing power. So Lincoln was approached by the European bankers and was offered money at 24 to 36% interest a year. Lincoln turned him down, and Lincoln also wisely elected not to borrow money from the bankers by creating a central bank. Lincoln did neither of the two requests of the bankers, either borrow the money at a high interest rate or create a central bank. Lincoln got Congress to create a paper money called the greenback. Lincoln actually got Congress to authorize the creation of $450 million worth of greenback dollars to pay for the cost of the war. As I said, the greenback was strictly a paper money. It was just printed, and it was made legal tender, which meant that the Northerners had to accept it as money during the war. But the money was not secured by gold, but the key, and it's the amazing key to the Civil War, was that the United States, the North, did not borrow the money from anyone. They just printed it. One historian has calculated that Lincoln's decision to create the non-interest-bearing greenback money saved the United States over $11 billion in interest alone. Thank you, President Lincoln. Some people didn't approve of that decision, however. This is an editorial on the subject of the American greenback dollar, and it appeared in the London Times during the Civil War, number 21. If this mischievous policy, financial policy, becomes a fixture, then the American government will furnish its own money without cost. It will pay off its debts and be without debt. It will become prosperous beyond precedent in the history of the world. That government must be destroyed. The London Times said, we've got to destroy the American government because it doesn't want to borrow money. And he said it will become prosperous, and that's what's going to happen, as we're going to see. In 1862, the Rothschilds issued what has been called the Hazard Circular. It read number 22. The great debt that capitalists will see to it is made out of the Civil War must be used to control the volume of money. In other words, the value of money must be established on debt, not on gold, but on debt. Let's continue. It will not do to allow the greenbacks to circulate as money any length of time, as we cannot control that. But we can control the bonds and through them the bank issues. Can you understand what he just said? We don't want a gold-backed currency. We don't want a paper-backed currency without interest. We want interest-bearing debt as the source or the basis for the money supply. And that's what this war was all about, as we're going to continue to explore. On February the 25th, 1863, Congress passed the National Banking Act. Now this law, or this bill, was supported by Salmon P. Chase, who was the Secretary of the Treasury at the time, and the National Banking Act created a national bank. It was chartered by the United States government that had the power to issue notes against bonds, and those notes were to be called U.S. bank notes. This money had no gold backing, but was borrowed, and it created interest. Fortunately, it was not the majority of the money that was issued to pay for the costs of the war. Abraham Lincoln, after the passage of that National Banking Act, said this, number 23, the money power. Notice what Lincoln called it, the money power. The money power preys upon the nation in times of peace and conspires against it in times of adversity. The money power will work until the wealth is aggregated in a few hands and the republic is destroyed. Notice, Lincoln figured it out. There was a money power behind the Civil War, and it was going to destroy the republic. Now this is an interesting sidelight. Now I've never seen this, but I've read this. But Salmon P. Chase's picture appeared on the greenback. Of course, as I said, he was the Treasury Secretary, so it might be some indication that the Salmon P. Chase was the darling of the banking establishment. About that time, after the passage of the National Banking Act, one of the Rothschild brothers wrote this letter, number 24. The few who can understand the system will either be so interested in its profits or so dependent on its favors that there will be no opposition from that class. While on the other hand, the great body of people, and notice this phrase, the great body of people mentally incapable of comprehending the tremendous advantages that capital derives from the system will bear its burdens without complaint, and perhaps without even suspecting that the system is inimical to their interests. In other words, we dummies are too stupid to figure the system out. And we'll bear the interest-debt burden because we simply don't understand. Well, now you have just read that quote, you do now understand, and you can figure it out. It is interesting that one of those mentally incapable of comprehending the benefits of the National Banking Act was Salmon P. Chase himself, the man who originated the bill. Salmon P. Chase later recanted and repudiated what he had done by passing the National Banking Act. He called it, number 25, my greatest financial mistake of my life. It has built up a monopoly that affects every interest in the country. It should be repealed. Salmon P. Chase, a little too late, but nonetheless, he saw what he had done to the American people. Lincoln faced another problem during the Civil War. European nations started getting involved. On November the 8th, 1861, the Queen of England dispatched 8,000 soldiers to Canada. And in July 1862, France sent the Emperor Maximilian into Mexico and imposed him on the throne. And I believe that Lincoln saw that England and France were flanking the North. He needed an ally. So Lincoln looked around Europe and tried to find an ally. We're going to cover that in a minute. But before I do, I want to point out one more thing, because this is also important as to where that ally would come from. Lincoln did not see slavery as the problem or the issue in the Civil War, as I've said. Lincoln saw the money power as the problem. In the late months of the summer of 1862, Lincoln said this, number 26, my paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union. If I could save the Union without freeing any slaves, I would do it. In other words, Lincoln realized slavery was not the issue. The banking system, the money power was. Not only was France moving troops into Mexico, they were building powerful ships for the South in 1861 and 1862. Their purpose was to break the blockade of the North to supply the South. Secretary of State William Seward warned France that if France continued to assist the South, it would mean war with the North. In other words, stay out of the war, France. In both England and France, by the way, this is very interesting, it was the ruling classes who strongly sympathized with the South. By the way, it's always been the ruling classes who support wars, because wars create debt, and debt creates interest, and the ruling classes draw the interest. That's what it's all about. As I said, Lincoln needed an ally, and I'm going to try to explain why Lincoln did what he did, or said what he said about the slavery issue in a few minutes. Lincoln looked around neutral Europe, and I believe he discovered that all of the major European powers had central banks controlled by international bankers, except one, Russia, a large nation that had no central or national bank. Russia also had a large navy, and it could assist Lincoln in a blockade. Russia also had strong anti-English and French sentiments, because in 1853 and 1856, between those dates, those years, those 3 or 4 years, Russia had fought the Crimean War between Russia, England, France, and Turkey. Russia was defeated and therefore had very little friendly thoughts about England and France. But more importantly, the Tsar of Russia, Tsar Alexander II, had freed the serfs, they're called the serfs, they were the peasant class, in early 1861. So remember that now, and we'll try to piece that together with Lincoln's statement about the freeing the slaves. On September the 22nd, 1862, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, claiming the right as a commander-in-chief of the Army and the Navy. Notice, Congress did not issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Mr. Lincoln did it on his own. Now, why did Lincoln issue that proclamation if he realized that slavery was not the issue? Let's go back to what Lincoln said, number 27. My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union. If I could save the Union without freeing any slaves, I would do it. Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation to free the slaves because he wanted to obtain the support of the Russian government. And here's why. Alexander II, the Tsar of Russia, said this, number 28. On the day on which your president, meaning President Lincoln, was inaugurated, which is March of 1861, we, meaning the government of Russia, the Tsar, signed the protocol which liberated 23 million serfs. Abraham Lincoln had freed 4 million slaves. Therefore, whatever he, meaning Lincoln, asks of Russia, Russia will grant. The Tsar of Russia was going to assist the United States in the war against the South. In September of 1863, after Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, maybe a year later, the Tsar of Russia ordered the Russian fleet into American waters. One fleet went into San Francisco, the other fleet went into either New York or Alexandria, Virginia. Now this is a picture of the Russian ship, and I'll pronounce it the best way I can. It was called the Osliaba. That's the best I can do. And this picture was taken by Matthew Brady in Alexandria, Virginia. There's a picture of a Russian ship in American waters. This is another picture of a ship. This picture came from a book by a Russian author, and it shows a Russian ship in the New York harbor. The Tsar gave orders to the admirals to be ready to fight any power, meaning Russia, either England and or France, and to take their orders only from Abraham Lincoln. In other words, Lincoln was now going to be in charge of the fleet belonging to the Russian government. In October of 1863, the city of Baltimore, Maryland, issued a proclamation welcoming the Russian fleet to America. The proclamation read, in part, number 29, the city of Baltimore extends an invitation to the officers of the Russian ships of war to visit the city as a testimonial of the high respect of the citizens of Baltimore for the sovereign and people of Russia, who, when other powers and people more strongly bound to us by the ties of interest or common descent. Now notice, who would they be referring to? I believe it's England and France, who had stronger ties to the United States than did Russia. So those nations have lent morals and material support to the rebels of the South, have honorably abstained from all attempts to assist the rebellion, and have given our government reliable assurances of their sympathy and goodwill. Now, isn't that interesting? The Russian government was now allied with Lincoln against the South, England, and France. Now, when I was in high school and college, I learned nothing at all, or very little, about England and France, and none whatsoever about Russia's involvement in the war between the states, the Civil War. Why are we being lied to about that involvement? Let's continue. When Russia involved itself in the war was basically over, because France canceled the order from the South for the blockade running ships, and when that was done, the South was on her own. Lincoln started planning, since he saw the war drawing to an end, a soft approach on the South after the war was over. In other words, welcome them back as mistreating or misbehaving children without any opposition or without any punishment. The radical Republicans in the Senate and the House opposed that movement, and they wanted the South to pay perhaps for the cost of the war, or they were to at least impose harsh restrictions on the South. It's interesting that the radical Republicans in the Senate and the House were frequently called the Jacobins. The Jacobins, as we heard a couple of weeks ago, was a name for the Illuminati after the Illuminati came here in 1786. Now, I don't have any direct knowledge that the Illuminati was involved directly, but it seems very interesting that those who were opposed to Lincoln were called the Jacobins, and the Jacobins was a name for the Illuminati. Isn't that interesting? The next step in our study is the election of 1864. Lincoln was re-elected, as perhaps you'll remember, for a term of 4 more years. And let's briefly cover the people who were the key people in his administration for the next 4 years. Number 30. Obviously, the president was Abraham Lincoln. The vice president was Andrew Johnson. The Secretary of State, as I've already said, was William Seward. The Secretary of War was Edwin P. Stanton. Please remember that individual, that name. We're going to see him again in a few minutes. And lastly, the key general of the North was Ulysses S. Grant. Please remember those 5 or 6 names. We're going to see them again throughout the next few minutes. These are the key people in the Lincoln administration. On March the 19th, 1865, Lincoln had a dream, which is very, very interesting. He dreamt that he went into the East Room of the White House, and there he saw a casket. And when he asked the guard why the casket was in the East Room of the White House, he was told that the president had died. And sure enough, Lincoln looked, I believe it was, he looked into the casket and saw himself laying there. Notice he had a premonition of his early death. And perhaps as you remember, on Good Friday, 1865, John Wilkes Booth assassinated President Lincoln at the Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. After Booth shot the president, he jumped to the stage, and while doing that jumping, he broke his leg. Remember that little detail of history? We're going to see that again in a few minutes. Now, that night, there were plans to assassinate at least 3 other individuals. The plan was not only to kill Abraham Lincoln, but it was also to kill Vice President Johnson, Secretary of State Seward, and the General Ulysses S. Grant. Lincoln's assassination was successful. Johnson's assassination failed, as did Seward's. And Grant fled the city, so no one really knows about him, whether he was assassinated or not, or even attempt was made on his life. Edwin P. Stanton regretted that he could not attend the Ford Theater that night with the Lincolns. That is very, very interesting, and we're going to see why. Also, Ulysses S. Grant was urged by Mr. Stanton not to go with Lincoln to the Ford Theater because Stanton told Grant that, quote, "your life may be in danger," unquote. And Grant was seen leaving the city that night under a full head of steam with his wagon and horse, I guess. So Grant somehow got advice that his life may be in danger, but Stanton never told Lincoln about it, and I'm going to tell you why that was so in a few seconds. As I said, John Wilkes Booth was a member of the Knights of the Golden Circle, created by the European bankers. 4 months after the assassination, this book was printed, entitled The Assassination and History of the Conspiracy. This book came out just 4 months after the assassination. It was published in 1865 by the J.R. Hawley and Company in New York and Cincinnati. And inside that book, the author makes this statement, number 31. The Order of the Knights of the Golden Circle originated the plot to assassinate Abraham Lincoln. Yet current historians rarely mention the group, and that's because the Knights have been officially buried. The American historians do not want us to know about the involvement of the Knights of the Golden Circle in the events of the Civil War, and I think their involvement is key to our understanding. In Washington that night, when Lincoln was shot, Stanton, the Secretary of War, quote, became in that moment the functioning government of the United States. There was no one else, unquote. Stanton issued orders to blockade the roads leading out of Washington, D.C. He sent troops to all of the roads. I believe there were 8 ways to get out of Washington that night, except one. Isn't that interesting? The road that Booth took to escape Washington, D.C. was the one road that Stanton did not blockade with the troops. That road, and here's a picture of it, crossed over the Navy Yard Bridge. That was the only way out of Washington not blockaded with Union troops by Secretary of War Edwin P. Stanton. Isn't that an interesting omission on the part of Secretary of War Edwin Stanton? I don't think so. Stanton later sent another man, a captain in the Southern Army, named James William Boyd, down that road. James William Boyd was the man that traveled the road, and I believe it was James William Boyd that was shot in the barn that we've heard so much about. Stanton later went down to that shooting, took the body of Captain James William Boyd, and certified that the man that was laying dead, Boyd, was really John Wilkes Booth. I don't believe it was at all. In fact, when you study the two gentlemen, you find out there were similarities, but not very many. Number 32. It's known that John Wilkes Booth had a mustache prior to the shooting, but that night had actually shaved it off when he visited the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd before he went out back into onto the streets or into the roads. The man that was shot that night in the barn had a mustache. John Wilkes Booth injured his left leg when he jumped to the stage. The man that was shot had an injury to his right leg. It was known that Captain Boyd had been shot and was limping as a result of that wound during the Civil War. John Wilkes Booth, at the time of the shooting, was 27 years of age, and the man who was shot in the barn was in his 40s. Isn't that interesting? Now, this is a picture of both Booth and the captain. And I want you to notice the amazing similarity between the two men. I believe it is the body of James William Boyd, the man on the bottom in this picture, that lies in the grave of John Wilkes Booth even today. As I pointed out, or just briefly alluded to, 8 people were charged in the assassinations and the attempts of the assassinations of Lincoln. And later, 4 of those 8 were hanged, including the first woman hanged in America. Those 8 people were involved in a conspiracy by definition. We talk only or remember only the shooting of President Lincoln, but 8 other people were involved as well. Stanton later obtained the diary of John Wilkes Booth. By the way, that diary today is in Ford's Theater. And if you look at it very carefully, and this is a picture of it, I don't know if you can see it or not, but if you look very carefully, you'll notice that there are pages missing in the center. Now this diary, those pages of the missing diary were found in the 1970s. And those pages showed who the real conspirators were. That were John Wilkes Booth had made names of, or listed their names or the details of their involvement. They were the northern bankers and senators and military officers. But yet there was no investigation. Very, very interesting. By the way, before we go to the next picture, I want to point out something that's also very interesting. I went to the Ford's Theater about a year or 2 years ago and stood there and looked at this diary. It's between 2 sheets of glass, and they've got it held open at the point where you can see the missing pages. And it's just hanging there in this glass case. It's kept open by these two sheets of glass. And the diary is open. You can see the missing pages. I stood there and looked at those pages and saw them and stood there for about 15 minutes and listened or watched as about a dozen or 15 people went walking by, many of which stopped and looked at the diary. Not one person commented about the missing pages. I think that's very interesting. We see evidences of this conspiracy all around us, but nobody thinks or even questions. And that's what the problem is, I believe, in America today. No investigation into why the pages disappeared. The real John Wilkes Booth committed suicide in 1903, 38 years after the assassination of President Lincoln. John Wilkes Booth was 65 years of age in 1903. And let me tell you a little bit, at least an interesting sidelight, and I believe this to be the truth, about how John Wilkes Booth committed suicide. I believe he was asked to drink arsenic by Jesse James, a fellow member of the Knights of the Golden Circle. I believe that Jesse James went to John Wilkes Booth because John Wilkes Booth, who was a member, as I said, of the Knights, was drinking too heavily and was revealing his true identity. Now, this is a picture of a mummy that Life magazine showed in one of its articles in 1938. I believe this picture, this is is the mummy of John Wilkes Booth. Doctors in 1938 examined the body of this mummy and noted that it had a broken left leg, just like John Wilkes Booth. So I believe that this is the body of the mummy of John Wilkes Booth. The reason it's a mummy is because John Wilkes Booth had drunk so much arsenic that he actually embalmed his body with it. And that's the way that the rooming house owner found the body a few days later. It was so well embalmed with it, they didn't need embalming fluid. And since he believed that the body was that of John Wilkes Booth, the rooming house owners preserved the body, and it showed up here 35 years later in a traveling roadshow. The war was over. The Civil War was over in 1865. What was the cost of the Civil War? Number 33. We can now examine that cost. The national debt in 1861, the amount of money that was borrowed by those during the Civil War, prior to the Civil War, was $90 million. By 1865, the national debt had grown to $2.7 billion. The national debt had increased, had gone up 30 times. Somebody made money on interest during that Civil War. Andrew Johnson, the vice president under Lincoln, became president upon the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, and he continued the soft treatment of the South. Those of you, and I'm sure all of you have heard this story, but you might remember what happened to Andrew Johnson. He was impeached and nearly removed from office by only one vote short. In other words, he was not removed from office, but came very close. In other words, I believe the radicals in the Senate and the House almost brought Johnson out of office because, as we're going to see, I believe the intent was to have a second Civil War, and Johnson didn't want that. Now, it's interesting, about 2 years later, after the war was over, the government of the North received a bill, I believe it probably wasn't a bill, but a letter of some form, from the Russian government. I like to laughingly call it the Tsar's rent-a-fleet. Now, here's the problem. During the negotiations between the North and the Russian government, our government agreed to pay for the expenses of the Russian government in sending its fleet to both the east and west coast of the United States. Johnson and Lincoln both had a real problem because there is absolutely no constitutional authority to draw taxpayers' money or even government money for any foreign government. The only way you can do it is to buy land. So here we have a problem for the United States, the North. The war was over. They had no authority to draw money to pay a foreign government for the cost of the fleet. By the way, going back to that, foreign aid is and was and will continue to be completely unconstitutional. There is no authority, even today, in 1988, for anyone's tax dollar to be taken from our government and given to any foreign government. There's no authority in our Constitution for that. Lincoln and Johnson both knew that. But they had to pay for the cost of the fleet. So the decision was made on April the 9th, 1867, to buy Alaska from the Russian government for $7.2 million as a way to give money to the Russian government. Today we call that movement, that sale, Seward's Folly, after Secretary of State Seward, who drew up the negotiations. Seward's Folly, but because we've been told that Russia was worthless. The Seward was, as I said, was the Secretary of State, but Seward and Johnson and Lincoln knew that it was the only way the American government could transfer money to any foreign government. It's very unusual to find any historian that will admit that. I did find one book that did that. I want to just bring it to your attention. This is, in fact, the only book that I think I've read, and I may have read about 20 on the Civil War, that talks about this fact. This little book is called Abraham Lincoln, The War Years, 1861 to 1864, and in Volume 2, the historian by the name of Carl Sandburg, who wrote this book, says this, number 34, the United States was to buy it, meaning Alaska, the purchase price to include certain naval expenses of the Russian government. That is a very rare admission that the purpose of the purchase of the Alaskan continent or Alaskan peninsula was to pay the Russian government for the use of the fleet. Russia saved the United States, the North, in the Civil War. Without that action, the South probably would have won the war. The Civil War was over, but not the plans. President Johnson, number 35, had no doubt there was a conspiracy afoot among the radicals, meaning the Jacobins, and quite possibly the Illuminati, to incite another revolution. And I believe there were plans for a second Civil War. In 1866, the Knights of the Golden Circle, the secret society created by the European bankers, created another secret society called the Ku Klux Klan. They were created by the Knights of the Golden Circle to go to the South and urge the blacks to revolt against the whites and provoke a second Civil War. It's known that there were at least 2 black and white riots, the first of which was on April the 30th, 1866, where a riot broke out in Memphis where whites were attacking Negroes, and 46 Negroes were killed. A little while later, about 2 months later, in July, on July the 30th, 1866, there was another riot in New Orleans where the Negroes were marching and the shots rang out and nearly 200 were killed. I believe the purpose of this was to create racial tension to provoke a second Civil War. That problem, about the second Civil War, was blamed on Andrew Johnson. Apparently, the bankers did not want a second Civil War. So Jesse James, the member of the Knights of the Golden Circle, the 33rd degree Mason, went to the West and stole gold there and then buried it. The purpose of that was to raise money, I believe, for a second Civil War. The second Civil War never came off, and it's one of my research projects to try to do some research to find out what happened and why that war did not come about. One of the interesting sidelights of history is the fact that the famous outlaw Jesse James lived to be 107 years old. Here's the early picture. We're going to see a picture of him again in a few minutes when he was over 100. The Accidental School of History records that Jesse James was killed by Bob Ford on April the 3rd, 1882. Here we see a picture of Jesse standing up on a chair, and I believe it's a chair or some form there, and he's dusting a picture and being shot in the back of the head. Now, I often used to wonder, even when I heard that story, why Jesse James would suddenly want to go around dusting pictures or straightening them out, but that's what we were told by those who write the Accidental School of History. But the truth is that Jesse and his cousin, the man who shot him, Bob Ford, staged a fake shooting so that Jesse could continue living under an alias. And in fact, Jesse used 72 aliases after this faked shooting. Isn't that interesting? Jesse lived to be over 100 years old. Now, this is a picture of Jesse when he was at that time 100 years old. He lived for about another 3 or 4 years. I believe he died at 104. if you want to earn $10,000, all you have to do is prove that that picture is not of the real Jesse James and the money is yours. I've been told that there's been no attempt to get that money because that is Jesse James. Our history books have been telling us another story, another version of the truth, and not the truth. The Jesse who was shot by Bob Ford was actually Charlie Bigelow. And Charlie was indeed shot in the back of the head, and then Mrs. Jesse James, the real wife of Jesse James, came running out saying, "There's Jesse laying on the floor." What they did was they put Jesse's clothes, Jesse's jewelry, Jesse's boots on the body, and then had the wife say, "There it is indeed my husband." Of course, the sheriff would be very happy to hear that, so that Jesse was finally dead, so he did not want to question it, especially when he had corroborating evidence of the wife. It's interesting that a fact of history, that is a fact of history, Jesse's mother came to see the body of Jesse, looked down and said, "That is not my son. That is not Jesse James." I believe it was only about 2 days later that she changed her mind. In other words, I believe they went to her and said, "Listen, Mom, that's really Jesse James, isn't it? And let me tell you why. Your son still lives." And so then she said, "I'm sorry, it is indeed my son." It's been reported that Jesse sang in his funeral choir and later was one of the 6 people carrying the casket. Isn't that interesting? Jesse was at his own funeral. Bob and Charlie Ford were cousins of Jesse. So, and after the shooting, they were both pardoned by the governor of Missouri, a man by the name of Thomas Crittenden. Thomas Crittenden was, by coincidence, I'm sure, a member of the Knights of the Golden Circle. Bob Ford got $10,000 for shooting, or allegedly shooting, Jesse James. One of Jesse's aliases was William A. Clark. Clark was a wealthy copper miner from Montana who was elected to the Senate from that state for one term from 1901 to 1907. I believe that Jesse James, the famous outlaw, sat in the Senate of the United States for 6 years between 1901 and 1907. One can only wonder how many of his descendants are in the Senate even today. I just wonder. Now, this is the death announcement of Senator Clark that appeared in the New York Times when the senator died in 1925. Now, I'm certainly not a photographic expert, but this picture looks to me like the picture of Jesse James at 100. Jesse claimed before he died at 104 that he faked the death of Senator Clark so that he could go to Paris under a different name, an alias. The reason that I believe that Clark was the same person as Jesse James is because the New York Times says that Jesse James was not. I believe that they wanted perhaps even to help Jesse James cover the story up. So the Civil War did not produce the central bank that the bankers had created the Civil War for. They had to change their strategy, and this they did, as we shall see. To understand the next period of American history, we must understand the banking industry. I want to go to the blackboard to help you understand that by giving you a brief explanation in about 10 seconds or maybe less, or maybe a few more, of how the banking system works. Let's just presume that all of us here tonight go to the bank and deposit $10,000. In fact, let's say that we create the bank with $10,000. And with that, that's the original capital of the bank. The bank does not keep that money on deposit, obviously. They take it, and about $8,000 of it goes out in loans, which means that they keep maybe 20%, or in this case, $2,000 on hand at any one time for the dispersing of funds, people coming in, cashing checks, whatever. 80% goes out, 20% stays on deposit. If all of the depositors went at the same time into our little bank example here, what would happen? The bank doesn't have the money. Only 2,000 of the 10,000 is in the bank at one time, so the other $8,000 is not there. So these people, the original banker, the original people who created the bank, have the power to start a run on the bank anytime they choose by simply going to the bank and withdrawing their money all at one time. This money is not available because it's been loaned out and it's disappeared. A man borrowed money to build a house. The money's gone to the contractor, the bricklayer, the electrician, etc. This is the strategy. Once we understand that only a percentage of the money is in the bank at any one time, with that understanding, now the next part of American history will make some sense. The U.S., as I said, between 1836 and 1860 had no central bank. 3 wars had not produced the bank, so the bankers tried a new strategy. They created artificial runs, panics if you want to, by this process. What they would do would be to blame a particular bank or the banking system as saying they're not solvent. And people would go to the bank and withdraw their money and cause a nationwide panic. This happened, as we're going to see, in 3 various and important depressions: 1873, 1893, and 1907. And then the bankers who caused the panic would offer a solution, the national bank, the central bank that they had wanted since the war between the English government and the American government, the American Revolution. Here's the strategy. Let's look at this thing. This is called the pincers movement. We've seen it before. We'll see it again. The conspirators say that the banks aren't the solvent. They're the bottom part of the pincers movement, the mob. The people in the middle demand action from the federal government, saying the banks aren't solvent, do something about it. And then the government offers, or the conspirators through the government offer us a federal bank. The arms grow together and the people suffer. That's what is known as the pincers movement. And that's the strategy they used, as I said, in 1873, 1893, and 1907. I want to talk first tonight about the artificial panic of 1893. Senator Robert Owen was not only a senator, but in private life was a banker. He testified before a congressional committee that the bank that he owned received from the National Banking Association what came to be known as the Panic Circular of 1893. The circular stated, quote, "You will at once retire 1/3 of your circulation and call in 1/2 of your loans," unquote. Now this is a little different strategy, but here they said, the bankers went out and said, call in your loans. Take back the $8,000 that you've loaned out all at once. And when that happened, there's a money shortage. That causes a run on the bank. People get frightened and worried.